And we're going to do something a little different today. Dale is going to be our presenter, but then Lori Scriven and Tom Brown are going to give brief reflections themselves. And so we ask you to hold your questions till after the reflections, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. Dale, I'll turn it over.
Good morning. So my task this morning is to set you out on the early history of Anglicanism, which I realized in preparing this presentation is actually a much larger scope than what I thought when I first got myself involved in this project. So, we begin Anglican origins, essential, unique, and recurrent characteristics of the descendant churches of the English Reformation. Oh-ho! So the point being that I am going to give you a brief timeline of history, historical dates that will set you in the sequence of the English Reformation, and then I'm going to talk about those three things. Essential, unique, and recurrent characteristics. And so boiling down some of the characteristics that are most important to us as Anglicans. Brilliant. It actually works. Here we have Henry VIII. Our dear Henry VIII sitting in the middle of the screen. And he has in both hands the Verbum Dei, the Word of God. This is a depiction of Henry VIII authorizing the Great Bible, the first official and authorized, recognized translation of the Bible into English. And he's handing it off, you see here, to the bishops of the church, and then over here to scholars and noble people. And actually down underneath would have been all of the peons. So I cut them off, unfortunately. So we only have Henry VIII here. But I put this up on screen because for most people, even most Episcopalians, when someone comes up to them and says, tell me the key person in the English Reformation, most of them are going to say, Henry VIII. Right. Because everybody knows the song, Henry VIII, I am, I am. And everybody, there's nothing like the story of Henry VIII running through wives, some of whom got beheaded, some of whom got thrown in prison, some who died in office, and all to try to produce a male heir for himself. And lo and behold,
the good old days, right?
The irony of history, it was both of the heirs ended up being female. So, here we have Henry VIII, and what I'm going to claim is that the English Reformation is unique because its primary impetus is a question of jurisdiction, not of theology or authority. So the question that the English Reformation asks, which is different from other Reformations, continental Reformations, who has claim to ecclesiastical jurisdiction in England? That, to put that into more layman's terms, is who has the right to govern the church in England? And the question spun out further is it someone far away and foreign, aka the Pope? Or is it someone English and nearby, aka the King? That is my hypothesis, is that is in fact the question of the English Reformation. And one of the reasons why the English Reformation ends up spinning out in unique ways. And then my second point to that is that the greatest tensions in Anglicanism, even to our present day, lie between those who want to make Anglicanism a question of authority and those who want to believe it is a question of jurisdiction. So as we see playing out in our current context, issues of scriptural authority, human sexuality, ordination of women, all of these come down to a question of who has the right to govern local churches. Some people want to take it to the theological level, but the reality is that Anglicanism has never asked that question. Anglicanism has always asked the question, who has the right to make the decision? So, with that, goodbye to Henry VIII. Here are some pre-Reformation dates. I think it's important for the English Reformation to set the stage. We believe that Christianity arrives in the British Isles sometime around 50 AD. That could be a little on the early side, but sometime in that 1st or 2nd century, we know that by the end of the 2nd century, Christianity is already there because we have witnesses writing about it. St. Alban, for whom St. Alban's Church, just around the corner, is named, is the first martyr recorded in Britain, circa 300 AD. We know that in 314, at the Council of Arles, the British clergy, including multiple bishops, a presbyter, and a deacon, were in attendance at the council. So we know by then, by 314, the church is not only established, but also well organized in England, in Britain. Now, what happens in between that, of course, is that in 410, the Romans leave Britain, and the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes invade. And Christianity is pretty much driven either out or underground. And what that leaves is that in 597, Pope Gregory sends Augustine to England to re-Christianize. This is what's called the Augustinian Mission, 597, and the importance of this is that Augustine becomes the first Archbishop of Canterbury. First Archbishop of Canterbury, 597, Augustine in England. In 664 is held the Synod of Whitby, which is when there were big debates between the churches in the British Isles about when Easter should fall. I know that seems like an unimportant question to us today, but in that day and age, it was worth splitting the church over. And there was the Roman way of calculating Easter, and there was the Celtic way of calculating the date of Easter. And a lot of those in the British Isles wanted to keep calculating it on the Celtic method. And the Pope and the Roman hierarchy wanted it calculated the Roman way. And they had the Synod of Whitby in 664 to argue it out. And Roman Christianity won out. I put that date on there as this is a significant turning point because what this represents is a recognition that the church in the British Isles is linked with the papacy. This is kind of the turning moment of recognizing that English Christianity is part of Roman Catholicism. The Synod of Hertford in 672 is the first synod where we see all of the bishops and priests and deacons of Britain get together in a synod around the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's really the first time that the Archbishop of Canterbury is recognized as the Archbishop, the head bishop of the British Isles. In 731, Bede writes an ecclesiastical history of the English people. He wanted everybody to know, for history's sake, what had happened in the development of English Christianity. And then jumping forward a number of years, in circa 1350, we have John Wycliffe and his followers in Oxford, who were called the Lollards. And Wycliffe was an early predecessor to the Reformation. He believed in the primacy of Scripture. He believed in predestination. He wanted to reform the clergy and the monasteries because they were too secular and not holy. And so Wycliffe, his teachings and his writings get shared in the Czech Republic, what is now the Czech Republic, and caused what's called the Czech Reformation, which was a predecessor that was shared and fed into the Lutheran Reformation. So the English, multiple centuries before, are already talking about Reformation ideas. So this is setting up the Reformation. I did want to mention, this is the martyrdom of St. Alban. This is from a Psalter, circa 1130 AD. This is an English illumination. You can see poor Alban here with his head on the ground. And you can see his spirit ascending to Christ in heaven, poor guy. Here we have the important dates of the Reformation. So the Reformation really sets off when the church gets together and by pressure of the crown recognizes the monarch as the head of the church in 1531. Now, they didn't just do it because of political reasons. They did believe that there was scriptural witness to say that the monarch, the king, should inhabit the place of jurisdiction over the local church. We could argue that till cows come home, but they thought at least well enough that they made a decision after a few days and they decided to recognize Henry as head of the church. In 1532 then, Henry stops appeals to Rome. So at that point in time, there were many reasons that clergy and dioceses and monastic houses would write to Rome for decisions about matters legal and matters ecclesiological. Henry stops it in 1532 and says, legal matters are decided by the crown, and spiritual matters are decided by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Then in 1534, the Act of Submission of the Clergy and the Act of Supremacy declares that Henry is forever, or the monarch is forever the head of the Church of England, submits the clergy to the monarch, and that is the official, if you count the date, establishment of the churches of England, Wales, and Ireland. Henry is excommunicated by the Pope for what he has done, and then he goes along and he dissolves the monasteries, because at that point in time, the monasteries in England were extremely wealthy. They held a large percentage of the land, and they were very powerful. And so he completely dissolves the monasteries. And then he begins, he and his circle begin a number of reforms. They set out a new set of doctrines in 1536, 7, and 39, the 10 Articles, the Bishop's Book, and the 6 Articles. They were a few points of doctrine that Anglicans at that time were said to believe. He authorizes the Great Bible in 1539, the first authorized edition of the Bible in English. The first English liturgy is set out in 1544. This is what we now call the Great Litany. That is, and we, as we say it, is almost identical to the way it was in 1544. In 1550, there was a big controversy, imagine, over vestments. Oh, how dare they? Bishop John Hooper had spent some time in Geneva among the Presbyterians, and he believed that there shouldn't be vestments in the church, that in fact clergy should officiate the offices in normal clothing. And this set off multiple decades of controversy in the English church about whether or not, in fact, we should wear vestments. This is also the beginning, the faction that wanted plain clothes clergy were called the Puritans. Yes, the Puritans. The Puritans begin with the vestments controversy in 1550. This is a draft of the 6 Articles, 1539, with Henry VIII's own markups. So he was very learned. The Tudor monarchs were very learned. He was learned in theology, and he was involved in how this all progressed. And I just love, look at this mess. How do you make any sense out of that? Continuing with the Reformation, so one of the interesting pieces of the English Reformation is that it lasts a very long time. So 1531, Henry is declared the head of the church, and I am going to say that the ending date for the English Reformation is the Act of Toleration in 1698. Okay, it's a long time. Of course, after Henry dies, his son Edward comes to the throne very young and dies young. And so Mary I comes to the throne as queen, and she is a Roman Catholic and sends the church right back to Rome in 1553. Then she dies in 1558 without an heir. And Elizabeth comes to the throne, Elizabeth I. And she is a Protestant. And so she takes the church back to Protestantism. At that point, any of the Protestant bishops who had remained in England had been killed. Right? They had been executed. So there was a crisis. We'll talk about this a little bit later. A crisis of episcopacy. And they had to bring bishops who had fled in exile to Switzerland back to England to consecrate Matthew Parker as the first Archbishop of Canterbury under Elizabeth, 1559. In 1560, they promulgate a new Bible because the Great Bible was not a very good translation. 1560, the Geneva Bible, but the problem is all of the commentary was very Presbyterian. So this caused problems for those who weren't so Presbyterian. In 1563, Elizabeth and the government put out the 39 articles. These are the ones we still have in the back of the Book of Common Prayer, the 39 articles of religion. And the point was not so much to create a confession of faith, but to present a middle way, we'll talk about this, a middle way between Presbyterian ideals and Roman Catholic ideals. Elizabeth is excommunicated in 1570. The Scottish Episcopal Church is founded in 1582. In 1611, James I calls together a group of scholars to do a really solid and middle-of-the-road translation of the Scriptures. That's really important, right? Translations of Scriptures change the way people perceive the doctrines that they get from them. So the authorized version, aka the King James Version, it comes out in 1611. The first church outside of the British Isles is established in Bermuda in 1612. In 1646, the Presbyterians come to power and they overthrow the monarchy. They cut off Charles I's head and they establish what's called the Commonwealth. And they abolish bishops. They get rid of them. Done with that. And the Church of England becomes Presbyterian. Until 1662, when they overthrow the Commonwealth, and they reestablish the monarchy, and they restore bishops to the Church of England. You'll note, too, that the current English prayer book is the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. That was the prayer book that came out just after the Restoration. The problem was that a number of the folks, so James the second who came to power in the Restoration was a Roman Catholic. So you have a Roman Catholic king as the head of the Church of England. This created great problems, and there was this became an era actually of a lot of greater understanding that there could be multiple different denominations living together in England at once. So the Quakers crop up around this time. The Baptists come to England. All of this, and then you have the Catholic king, and there's a group of bishops, conservative bishops, who get their panties in a twist, and as a result, they are denied their sees, they're denied their dioceses by the crown, and they're sent into exile in Scotland. They're called the non-jurors. They are then solidified when James is overthrown, and William and Mary come to the throne, both of whom are very Protestant. And the problem is that English clergy had to swear, to be ordained, you had to swear an oath of allegiance to the monarch. The non-jury bishops said, well, the monarch is still alive because James was sent into exile in France. The monarch is still alive, we can't swear allegiance to William and Mary. That's why they're called the non-jurors, or the non-swearers. The non-jurors. And then in 1698, they roll out the Act of Toleration for Nonconformists, which for the first time allows Baptists and Presbyterians and other denominations of Christianity to practice openly in England, which lets the pressure off of the Church of England. Before that, no matter who you were or what you believed, you had to go to church in a Church of England parish, or you had to pay a tax for it. So they roll out the Act of Toleration. Finally, people can be Baptist, and finally, people can be Presbyterian and not have to worry that they're going to be burned at the stake for it. And this ends the Reformation because it lets the Church of England develop. Finally, it hits a period of stability where it is itself, and anybody who disagrees can go and find where they fit best. And finally, a few dates after the Reformation, because it kind of trickles out, Methodists come along in 1784 when John Wesley begs for a bishop to ordain him clergy for the United States, and the bishop refuses, and so John Wesley says, well, forget you, I'm going to ordain them myself. He was a priest. Priests don't ordain people, at least not in the Anglican tradition. And so in 1784, Methodism crops off. Samuel Seabury, our very own Samuel Seabury, goes, because there were not bishops in the colonies, Samuel Seabury, the people of Connecticut get together and raise money to send him to England to be ordained bishop, the first bishop of the Episcopal Church in 1784. He goes to England. They say to him, well, you have to swear the oath of allegiance to the king. He says, I'm an American, although I was a royalist, I'm an American, I can't swear the oath. They say, no ordination for you. So he packs up his bags, and guess where he goes? Scotland, to the non-jurors, because the non-jurors did not require an oath of allegiance to the king, because they had long since passed that by. And so he is ordained bishop in Scotland by the non-juring bishops of Scotland. That starts, of course, the American Episcopal Church. 1786 is when the first draft of the Book of Common Prayer comes out. In 1789 is when the first General Convention is held and the Church's Constitution is established. In 1829, finally, Roman Catholics are allowed to practice openly and hold political office in England. This sets off a whole movement because suddenly Anglicans can see what Roman Catholics do and realize that we have more in common than we think. And that starts what's called the Oxford Movement. In 1833, the government gets together and starts chopping off dioceses in Ireland, and people get really upset about that. And so they say the government shouldn't have that much control over the church, because the church is the church. And what we get is the recovery of Catholic practice in Anglicanism. Religious orders are refounded in 1840s and 50s, and then in 1886, the development of what's called the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral, where Anglicanism the bishops get together and want to figure out what it means to work ecumenically with other denominations. What are the basic elements required to make a real church? This is, I love this. Yeah. This is William Henry Hogarth, who's an 18th century satirist, just completely loves to poke fun at Anglicans. And here you have church on Sunday morning. You notice everybody is sleeping. You notice they've hung their hats up. You notice this is the way Anglican worship was. Anglican worship was extremely Protestant until the Anglo-Catholic revival. It was entirely centered around the reading of the word and the preaching. Here you have, they were usually in double-decker or triple-decker pulpits. So you have the priest up top, or the minister reading from the book of homilies. You read sermons that were already pre-written. And then down here you have the clerk, who would read the responses. The people didn't get to read the responses. The Lord be with you and with thy spirit. No, the clerk read them for them. Because they're sleeping. They're sleeping. So, Anglican worship, and realistically, Anglican worship in the 18th century, that kind of 100 years between the Restoration and the beginning of the Anglo-Catholic movement, was known for being extremely sleepy. It was very stable. Finally, it had achieved stability, but it was known for being deathly. And so you get a lot of fun being poked in the press.
Dale wasn't required to go. It
was not required anymore to go. Thank God.
Thank you.
So that brings me to the actual topic. Oh my! I told you it was a much larger topic than I expected. So when I was thinking about Anglicanism and the development of Anglicanism, I wanted to distill down some essentials. And what I realized, I think, I'm arguing that there are two essential characteristics to Anglicanism that make us who we are and without which you can't be Anglican. You could be something else, but you can't be Anglican. The first of those is the threefold orders of ministry founded on the continuous episcopacy and in the medieval cursus honorum. That makes no sense to any of you yet, I will say. And then the second is complete uniformity in liturgy. So watch this. Threefold orders of ministry. Here we have bishop, priest, deacon. This is from the Sacramentary of Marmoutier in 1850. Or 850 rather, 850, bishop, priest, and deacon. Those are the three, or bishop, deacon, and presbyter, right? The three orders of ministry. The cursus honorum, it was inherited by the church from Roman hierarchy of positions. And so in order to become a magistrate, you had to start at a lower level and you moved up. The same is true for us, is that we inherit this from the early church, is that in order to become a priest, first you're ordained a deacon. You're ordained a deacon, then you can be ordained a priest. And then you can be ordained a bishop, if that is in fact what ends up happening. But you can't jump. Like someone isn't ordained directly a priest. There are churches that maintain these three orders of ministry. There are Reformed churches that maintain these orders of ministry, but that are more direct in the route to get there. So for example, the Scandinavian Lutheran countries have bishops, and they have deacons, but one is ordained directly. So it's a little bit different. The second point of the threefold orders is that we're in apostolic succession, which means a bishop is ordained in linear continuity with duly consecrated bishops before. So every bishop, Samuel Seabury, can trace their lineage back at least to the early medieval church. They would say, some people would argue all the way back to Christ. The documentation isn't that good, I promise. Okay. But the idea is right, is that every bishop is ordained by three other bishops in succession. And what this brings up is that in 1120, there was what was called the investiture controversy, which was the question whether it was the Pope or the monarch had the right to choose bishops and other clerical positions. This sets off the theology of what Henry VIII comes up with in the 1530s, which is the Pope doesn't have the right. I'll choose who gets to be bishop. I'll choose who gets to be abbot, whatever it is. Okay. And then the third thing is that the episcopacy, the continuous episcopacy, has been tested out in Anglicanism by fire. We have hung on to it against all odds because in 1559, like I told you, all of the remaining bishops had either gone into exile or had been killed. And so they had to find a way to get bishops, three, right, it takes three, to come back in succession and ordain Matthew Parker as the first Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1662, likewise, after the Commonwealth, many of the bishops had been killed. And so again, Anglicanism had a crisis of episcopacy and had to find bishops to come back and ordain bishops again. And then in 1784, here in good old the US of A, against all odds again, the American Episcopal Church faced the real question of whether or not to have bishops. And William White, who became the first presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, wrote a long treatise arguing that we should become like the Methodists, and that we shouldn't have bishops, and that we should ordain by priests ordaining priests. And the church raised the money to send Samuel Seabury to England and Scotland to get ordained a bishop, so that we would in fact continue to have bishops. So the episcopacy is an essential characteristic of Anglicanism. And then uniformity in liturgy, aka common prayer. Here you see the list of the rolling out of common prayer books, or of English liturgies. Great Litany in 1544. In 1548, Henry authorizes that interposed into the Latin Mass, there would be English pieces, one exhorting the people so that they knew what they were doing when they were taking communion, one an English version of the Confession of Sins, and so that was 1548. 1549, in Edward's reign, is the first Book of Common Prayer. 1549 is also the first Act of Uniformity, which requires that anybody leading public worship uses the prayer book. So it's not an option. It's a legal. It's a binding document. And then in 1550, the first English ordinal. And then successively in the English, Scottish, and American, and then of course other Anglican provinces, there are what are called prayer book revisions. So we don't create new prayer books, we revise old prayer books. Seems like a distinction without a difference, but it really isn't. And for example, in our 79 Book of Common Prayer, much of the material is directly descended from the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. In fact, the confession that was added to the Latin Mass in 1548 is still in Rite 1. So that continuity of liturgy is really important to Anglicanism. And for example, in our church, the prayer book is a constitutional document, which means that ordinands, when we are ordained, we are required to make and sign an oath of conformity that we will abide by the doctrine, doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church. So it still remains that one of our essential characteristics is prayer book liturgy is the thing. It's the binding element. Common characteristics, the via media, or the middle way, and literary musical beauty tempered by popular intelligibility. These are characteristics. I promise you, I spent hours thinking up these ideas. So these common characteristics are characteristics that are very often found among Anglican churches, but don't necessarily, if you didn't have a really good choir, wouldn't make you less Anglican. You see what I'm saying? And there are plenty of Anglicans who, no matter how much we call it the middle way, who end up on one end of the spectrum or the other as far as the extremes of theology or politics or whatever. So here we have, this is my favorite graphic of all of them. This is the sound head, the rattle head, and the round head. This is from 1642. Here you have a good Presbyterian Anglican, kind of a Puritan Anglican clergyman, as you see, dignifiedly dressed in all black, no vestments. Here you have the rattlehead who is divided in himself between the vestments of episcopacy of the bishop and the Jesuit gown. Oh, he's leaning to Rome. Oh. And here we have the roundhead, that was literally like calling somebody an idiot, who is fully Roman Catholic, a monk. You can see how charitable Anglicans were. I mean, just wonderfully charitable, right? And of course, the sound head. Here we have true religion. So the middle way, why I bring this graphic and why I love this graphic is because in many ways, the rattlehead is exactly the Anglican stance, right? Which is this constant tension back and forth between medieval traditionality, and reform. And here I have, here, look at this. This is my list of the back and forth, right? Roman, Calvinist, Roman, Calvinist, Roman, Calvinist, Roman, Calvinist, Roman. There's this constant leaning in history in Anglicanism. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that really represents an inner wrestling, a rattleheadedness about what it means to be Anglican. And I've listed the traditional kind of monikers, High Church, which tends to be an emphasis on free will, the church as an institution, episcopacy, the sacrament, ceremony and worship and beauty. Low church, which tends to be an emphasis on predestination, personal conversion, personal holiness, scripture and simplicity. Broad church comes along in the late 19th century with an emphasis on ecumenism, social justice, and Anglicanism as a facilitator of Christian unity. You would think that broad would be halfway between low and high, right? It's not. Anglo-Catholicism is an emphasis on continuity with the Church of Rome and Tridentine liturgical practices, and in some cases a desire for reunion with Rome. So, we kind of throw these about a lot with little or no definition, but these are terms that really point back to the inherent tension in Anglicanism, and that is that there is always this swinging back and forth between high and low. High and low. And somewhere in there is what we call the via media. And this is where I will end. The literary and musical beauty. And that is that the English Reformation happens at the tail, kind of in the heart of what is not anymore called the English Renaissance, but is a recognition that from about 200 years before until about 100 years after, there was this incredible flourishing of literature in the British Isles. And that works its way out in the language of the prayer book, right? The beauty, the insistence on poetry, and that Anglican, the great Anglican divines, those we would call kind of great devotional thinkers of Anglicanism, write poetry. It's a literary tradition. It's a tradition that's wrapped up in the beauty of language. And also, Anglicanism maintained a musical heritage. Here we have, this is the procession at the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1604. And here we have the peers in their nice gowns. And here we have the gentlemen and children of the chapel. Boys' choir of men, choir of men and boys. The reality is that somehow, through the Reformation, the importance of choral music remains. And we've inherited that down to this day, even though there have been periods where it has waned a lot. So, I'm pushing up against time, so.
No idea how to follow that. I think my charge was to explain how I got here and why I stayed. An Anglican, an Episcopalian, and really more an Episcopalian than an Anglican, I believe, because I think the Episcopal Church has to do with how our country was founded as well, based on a democracy. And I really believe in the power of the people, if you will. So, my point is that I really believe in the middle way, the via media. I like the concept of locality. And again, this has to do with the people, because we are the ones, we are the church. We are the ones that call our priests. We are the ones who make our polity and choose our bishops. It's not from the top down. So this is important to me. And I came to this church, some of you may know, some of you may not know. My background is, I was raised a Christian Scientist. So religion and rites and ritual and it was all incredibly foreign to me and very much frowned upon. So when I came to this church, I was incredibly fortunate to be influenced by two wonderful role models, my in-laws, who never judged, who allowed me to grow and learn at my own pace. My mother-in-law said to me at one time that Episcopalians were Catholics who thought. She believed in education, she believed in learning, she believed in reading, which you may or may not know if you knew her, and so did I. as a Christian Scientist, I studied. It was what you do every Sunday. You read the lesson, you we didn't have a Book of Common Prayer to read, but we had the writings of Mary Bay Ferretti, the founder of the religion. And so we read those every week. I was always wanting to learn more. Even when I found that it wasn't answering my questions, it wasn't fulfilling what I needed, I sought other faiths. And I started to head toward Catholicism because I had a lot of friends who were Catholics. And so when I came to this church, it seemed familiar. The liturgy was familiar, but I sure wasn't going to kneel, and I sure wasn't going to take communion, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the patience and non-judgmental nature of my in-laws was something that I value and appreciate very much to this day. The other point that I really want to make, though, is that I love about Episcopalianism and Anglicanism is this concept of the three-legged stool. That everything is sort of balanced. It's kind of a not a super stable balance, but it's a balancing act of scripture, tradition, and reason. And for me, that answers it completely, because I spend a lot of time trying to reason things out. I spend a lot of time in my head. But liturgy keeps you focused on, and it's not boring. It's the same, but it's not redundant. You learn something all the time from it, and it's comforting. It's the boundary. It's the foundation. And then Scripture provides us with this incredible story, which we're constantly trying to interpret. So for me, this just has it all.
Thank you. I was hiding in the back so I wouldn't have to directly follow Dale. Yeah, very well. That was great. Thank you. I would also say that one of my concerns about condensing this into 5 minutes was that I was afraid my path to faith was really weird and convoluted, but after the 45 minutes of Dale's presentation, it seems a lot more straightforward. So, that said, my path to faith, I think, really started about 30 years ago. Strangely enough, when two people that were kind of at the epicenter of a youth culture movement that was a big part of my life became Hare Krishna monks, dropped out of the art music scene and disappeared, and started preaching Hare Krishna. And this began this battle over the last 30 years of my heart and my head grappling with the idea of God and faith. And it was partly because everything they said made my head hurt. But my foolish heart was, I just thought they looked super cool, which is really a stupid first step toward faith, but they did. The clean head, the robes, they were always in a group, it was like a big gang. They seemed stable and happy and just solid in their faith, which was really attractive. So my head insisted on, my heart was going to lead this path, leading toward this path. I had to find something that maybe looked as cool, but didn't seem as crazy. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out Buddhism. But if you've ever just randomly, without a guide, tried to dive into Buddhism, it's as weird and convoluted and contradictory and argumentative as any other faith. And so I spent a lot of time reading a lot of very difficult books. Thankfully, I found a person who put out this podcast. He's a strange Minnesotan descendant of Baptist ministers who became a surfer in California and a professor of world religions at Columbia University. and he's had this great podcast on Buddhism. It's a huge step for me because it was plain spoken. He spoke like the guys I like hanging out with, and he made certain concepts very clear to me that sort of gave me a faith beyond, that my head couldn't grasp all that was real. And oddly enough, he kept talking about the Bhagavad Gita, which is what the Hare Krishna guys were always talking about, and I could never understand. But he kept talking about that. So this Buddhist was talking about this Hindu text. And in the meantime, thanks to social media, I started following those two guys, and they had gone from, kind of fundamentalist Hare Krishna, just very adamant and just, again, stuff that didn't make sense in my head, to a very devotional form of Hinduism that was led by the heart. And oddly enough, the Buddhist guy who had the podcast, his wife talked about the Bhagavad Gita and about just ditching all the theology and all the thinking and all the head stuff and following the beauty that's calling to your heart, following the love that you see in front of you and not trying to think about it so much. At the same time, my family and I had started going to a Unitarian church, which was really the first time I really got to hear about the Christian faith from scholars, from kind of typical fundamentalist American Christians and thought leaders. And thanks to the brilliance of YouTube, found some of the beauty in sacred music and other thinkers of the Christian faith. And how I ended up at the Episcopal Church when we moved to Cleveland about 2 years ago was striking to me that a large percentage of the Christian thinkers who I was now listening to and the churches that were creating the music that I love were either Anglican or Episcopalian. And rather than thinking about why and reading all these books that Dale has read to explain why that might be, when I moved to Cleveland, I followed my heart to these people, these ideas, this tradition that was creating some fantastic approaches to the gospel, and my head kind of let my heart lead me here, and it's worked out terrifically since. It's a wonderful community, wonderful sermons, wonderful priests, and it's been great. My head is happy, my heart is happy. It's worked. I don't know why, I couldn't explain it, but it's worked out.
Any questions?
Who was the speaker? Yeah, who was the second speaker?
This was Tom Brown.
Sorry.
And Lori Scriven. Leo.
Do you have time to expand a little bit? I wasn't aware that predestination was actually an insignificant factor in the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church, so I'm curious about that.
Great question. Leo asks about predestination as a doctrine of Anglicanism. Yes, Anglicanism, what's interesting is that the two poles of Anglicanism are Calvinism, which is fully predestinationalist, and Catholicism, which is fully free will. And what crops up in the mid-1600s is what's called Arminianism, which is God somehow predestines us, but we have full free will. Again, the Anglican middle way, right? But yes, predestination is absolutely, and in fact, in the 39 articles, it speaks about predestination. So, yes. Matthew?
I'm curious, you said that they needed 3 bishops to consecrate another bishop. When you sent Seabury across to get consecrated, they have to send like 2 more people to start?
Great question. Since it takes 3 bishops to consecrate a bishop, Matthew asks if, when we sent Seabury across, he became bishop and came back to Connecticut. How did he make more bishops? Well, what happened was just a few years later, the English Parliament got wise and realized that they were worried about the American the new United States being under the influence of Scotland. And so they changed the laws. so that for provinces outside of the UK, there wasn't an oath of allegiance to the monarch. And so we sent two more, who were William White and the other guy in New York, and they were consecrated, and then they came back, and then we sent a third from Virginia, so New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia, and then the first Native consecration on American soil was a guy named Claggett, Bishop Claggett, in I think 1795 or something like that. So, Bill?
Talk about the current dynamic tension associated with what I'll call the democratic nature of the U.S. and Canadian Anglican Church versus the more autocratic in other areas of life.
That's right.
And how does that relate to what you talked about earlier?
Bill asks the question, how do we hold in tension that, for example, the United States, the Episcopal Church here, in Canada, in Scotland, are all based very much on a democratic system. So the laity gets together in conventions and makes the decisions about how the church is run, versus many other provinces of the Anglican Communion where the bishops make decisions about where a priest goes, and there's much more power concentrated in the bishop's office. And that is literally at the heart of the tensions that we see in the Anglican Communion and have seen for about 20 years now. So the question of who gets to make decisions, this goes back to my initial hypothesis about the question of jurisdiction. Who gets to make the decision about what the Episcopal Church is doing in the United States, or what the church is doing in Tanzania? There has been a movement in the last quarter of the 20th century to concentrate more power in the Archbishop of Canterbury as a kind of pope. What's interesting is that historically Anglicanism has seen jurisdiction as entirely local. I think that's hugely important to our tradition, is that people in the United States make decisions about what happens in the United States, and that may be very different from what happens somewhere else in some other context, and that's okay, and we can be in communion no matter. We don't always get along that well about it, but does that get there a little bit?
Well, and how does that relate specifically to the missals or Book of Common Prayer in different countries? For instance, New Zealand's Book of Common Prayer has some theologically significantly different than the United States.
Yes. All prayer books are developed by their local province. And so the revisions are done by the people or the bishops of a given province. And so there is a lot of autonomy there. So Lamar?
A very quick question. First of all, great program. Second question, how many of you in this room were actually raised as Episcopalians from the Church? What's interesting is about half were not, which means this program is invaluable. So thank you.
You know, that in the Episcopal Church, I think it's 72% of clergy come from other denominations. It is very much a destination denomination in that sense. It really is, which is really interesting because cradle Episcopalians are few. It's a rare species anymore.
As your Lutheran/Episcopalian, I will end by saying, let us go pray.